Why It Matters, Care and Integrity in Cataloguing. This first session has emerged from conversations between members of our trade and our institutional colleagues. In particular, I believe the genesis can be traced back to the engagement between ILAB and Stephanie Stillo, Chief of Rare Books and Special Collections at the Library of Congress, Washington. And she's also head of IFLA Rare Books and Special Collections section. Stephanie Stillo gave a presentation to the ILAB President's meeting in Amsterdam last year on strengthening the relationship between librarians and booksellers. But even before that, she had been in conversation with ILAB Executive Secretary Angelica Elsner and other members of the ILAB committee on reparative cataloguing practices. Two of the questions that have arisen from this ongoing conversation and that are proposed here today are these. How do we, as guardians of our printed heritage, ensure that records are accurate, respectful, and free from bias? And what responsibility do booksellers and librarians have when describing sensitive and contested materials? Our speakers are Professor Lynette Russell, AM, from Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, on my left, and Nina Whitaker, Senior Librarian at Museums Victoria, and Alexander Aiken from Bellarium Books in San Francisco, and also the current president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, the ABAA. Professor Lynette Russell has been asked to set the scene regarding the broader movement of decolonising knowledge systems and how historical records, including book descriptions and classifications, often reflect colonial biases. While drawing our attention to the history of disturbing material that is often deeply unsettling and offensive to groups and individuals, she will also share her views on censorship from an historian's perspective. I look forward to her setting the scene in which booksellers and librarians find themselves facing decisions about descriptions and display. And then following on from this, Nina Whitaker and Alexander Aiken will share experiences and practical examples from the library and bookselling perspectives. Our speakers have given a lot of thought to this topic, and we can look forward to hearing important information and views, to questions being answered and perhaps to more questions emerging. Save your questions. There will be time for a Q&A at the end. So having given this overview of the session, it's now my pleasure to properly introduce you to Professor Lynette Russell, AM, Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor and Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. She is focused on developing an anthropological approach to the story of the past. Her historical interests are far-ranging across the 16th to the 20th centuries, from Aboriginal people in the maritime industry to the Gunditjmara and Wurundjeri people of Victoria to the last 1,000 years of encounter history. She's currently examining Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese and Macassan encounters and contacts. An award-winning author who has written or edited over 20 scholarly books, we are privileged and delighted to have her speak with us today to set the scene. So please welcome Professor Lynette Russell. I just press that? I do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the invitation. And the chance that it's given me to think about some of the issues that I think are really important. I'm grateful that we had an acknowledgement of country to start with. I think that's a really important way to set the scene. The reason I'm showing you the map up there, the IATSIS map, is because it's just to remind everybody, particularly our visitors, our international visitors, that Australia was home to over 250 different languages and 600 different cultural groups. So when people talk about the Aborigines or the Indigenous people, just keep in mind that there was a very wide variety. So where we are now, Naarm, as was mentioned, is the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation.
I'm a very unusual historian because I have Aboriginal heritage from my father's side, and that's from Western Victoria, the Watchabullock people of Western Victoria. And on my mother's side, we're descended from convicts. So it's really, I feel like there was no choice but to go into history. As educators and researchers, we recognise the responsibility that we carry in shaping the knowledge systems and narratives. We're committed to working with genuine partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that's been a primary underpinning of all of my work. And that's because I want to centre, whenever I can, Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous voices, and I want to respect their cultural authority. So it's really about, with reflection on that I really want to talk about some of the issues around decolonising and cataloguing. So as I say, I come to you not merely as an academic, I'm a historian. Someone whose professional life has been dedicated to understanding the past in all of its complexity, and I hope that I helped others to do the same for others. It's from that position, that vantage point, that I speak about why I'm fundamentally opposed to some of the censoring that I'm seeing happening within libraries and other GLAM sectors. But first, I'm not a collector of books. That seems like an odd thing to say for someone who lives in a home with 22,000 books. But I'm not a collector of books, nor is my partner, who is also a professor. We don't collect books, we collect knowledge. Our library is a research library, it's a reference library. And I'm not particularly concerned about the condition. I'm not particularly concerned about whether or not I can get something on an electronic device as opposed to a hard copy. What I'm looking for is always what's inside. Much of my thinking about this particular topic has been motivated by something I read, rather disturbingly read, not terribly long ago in a newspaper. And it was about what was described as a cleansing practice in various libraries, often conducted by, I would say, people with limited historical skills, but with a great sense of recreational outrage. In recent years, we've seen that growing movement, often driven by political pressure or public discomfort, to ban or remove books from schools and curricula. Sometimes books are considered to have offensive language, sometimes they address things inappropriately, issues around race, gender, sexuality, colonialism. It's often described as somehow protecting the younger people, preserving public values. But I would have to say that censoring books in any way, and that includes within the catalogues, is a dangerous path, and I think we've seen it before, and we don't want to go down that path. This, my presence here at this event actually came from literally bumping into Douglas Stewart in Amsterdam. I was there doing some research and we saw that the book fair was on, so we thought we'd go off and we ran into Douglas. And he mentioned that he'd like me to come and have a chat. In the conversation we were having, he also mentioned that he was having some difficulty with a particular item that he'd found, beautiful piece, a historic piece, and he'd offered it to one of the state institutions, and they'd taken some ridiculous amount of time, more than a year, to decide whether or not they wanted it. And it was really because it was going through a kind of cultural protocol, whether or not they should take it or not take it. And it seemed to me, when we discussed it, it seemed a very uncontroversial thing. It was a map of some description. And it struck me then that even when we don't know that there's a kind of gatekeeping going on, even at that level of acquisitions, we still are having people decide what we should and shouldn't collect. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that everything should be open to the public, because some things are offensive, some things are inappropriate. But what I think is really important is that we collect as much as we can, and we have it there for the bona fide researchers and the bona fide community members that want to see it. So historical research depends on intellectual freedom and a commitment to intellectual freedom. We depend on free exchange of ideas, a pursuit of truth. We question assumptions and challenge the dominant narratives. Censorship in any form, that includes deciding not to purchase something, denies us access to the full spectrum of human thought. At the very heart of my discipline is the commitment to intellectual freedom and the freedom to ask very difficult questions. I wrote a piece a number of years ago, which was really controversial at the time, and it was on infanticide. And I argued that historically infanticide was something that was practiced as a form of family control, birth control, controlling family size. This was really controversial. People were very upset with me. But I stand by the fact that without doing that sort of research, we don't really understand the context of the societies that we're studying from the past. So once you begin censoring what can be read or taught or borrowed, you're no longer writing or studying history, you're managing it. And that, I'm going to argue, is propaganda, not history. Even when books are racist or sexist or otherwise have disturbing content, they have value to us as historians, not because we condone what's in them, but because they tell us something about the people and the politics, the social norms of the time. They are evidence. Historians are trained to contextualise, not to sanitise. We don't read texts to accept them at face value. We read them to understand the conditions that produced them. You're going to hear me say the word contextualise again and again and again. If you take nothing else away, my argument today will be that when cataloguing books, make sure you have as much context in there as possible. Don't shy away from the controversial or the unpleasant or the political. Include it, but make sure that you contextualise it. As I say, historians read these books to understand the conditions that produce them. And for a lot of us, people like me, those books also form our primary source. We don't always have archives to go to. Sometimes our books from the 19th and early 20th century, the 18th even, and 17th centuries are all we have. That's where we start. They're our primary source. Removing those books from view doesn't erase the bigotry of the past. It simply makes it harder to study it and harder to learn from it. Even books with offensive and controversial content are frankly extremely valuable artefacts. They allow us to contextualise the social milieu of the time. And this is something historians are uniquely trained to do. One thing history teaches us is that censorship has always been the tool of control, from authoritarian regimes to colonial governments. Those in power sought to limit access to ideas and challenge the status quo. Once we accept that some books can be banned, it becomes easier to ban others and then others and then others. It will never stop with just the worst books. There's a reason totalitarian systems always begin by purging the library, the archive, the university. They understand what many of us forget. Controlling the narrative is the first step to controlling the future. The historical record needs to be preserved, warts and all. As historians, we are custodians of the past. It is our job to preserve the historical record so that future generations can access it. I often think about the future Aboriginal kids born in, 100, 200 years' time, who will have the opportunity to go and look at those books and learn something about their history and their past. And yes, it's from the perspective of the colonisers. Yes, it's through the lens of colonialism. But if we can add the context around it, we can build the support so that they can read it and understand it and recognise it, contextualise it, then all the better. By doing this, we aren't making it harder for someone someday to ask new questions of old material. This is not about nostalgia or preserving everything for its sake. It's about ensuring that history, the real, messy, difficult, ugly history, remains accessible, intact, and open to scrutiny. A historian's duty includes safeguarding the integrity of the historical record by altering, banning, destroying, refusing to allow people to read, controlling. All of those things destroy the integrity of the historical record. I want something that's intact, accessible, and open to scrutiny. And it is our duty to safeguard the integrity of the historical record. Now, some people argue, and I know this was one of the arguments that was put forward in terms of a particular library cleansing that I was aware of quite recently, which did even included the removal of books that used terms as offensive as the Aborigines. The Aborigines being an adjective, rather a noun, which is no longer used. Rather, people use the adjective Aboriginal people, Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal society. But to go through and find books that were written in the 1920s or the 30s or the 40s, using terminology that was entirely appropriate at the time, and decide that these things should be removed from purview, to me is a form of vandalism. Now, I'm not foolish enough to think that libraries don't deaccession from time to time. We know they do. And that, of course, is something that has to be built in. But simply removing books like that because they contain a term that somebody today finds offensive, I have a dramatic problem with. Censorship undermines the educational process. Students and citizens need to learn how to critically engage with difficult texts. They shouldn't be shielded from them. Historians advocate for teaching tools, not filters, so that individuals can confront those uncomfortable histories responsibly. Historians have a moral obligation to oppose the silence. I hope I'm on the right. Not quite, it doesn't matter. Many of the histories we now treasure, Indigenous histories, queer histories, women's histories, were for centuries censored, ignored, left out. If we embrace censorship today, we risk returning to a place where only the dominant voices are heard. And they might be a different set of dominant voices to the ones you might expect. They may not be male, pale and stale. They may actually be a different form. But I still think we need to be wary of privileging one group over another. We cannot advocate for silenced histories while simultaneously endorsing the silencing of others. The past cannot be redacted to suit the politics of the present. So to censor is to privilege certain voices and experiences over others. Historians strive to recover marginalised voices. I've spent the last 30 years of my career trying to find those voices of Aboriginal people in the records, in the historical records, in the books. It's not always easy. They're usually anonymous, often mute, but occasionally you get that moment where you can just break through and you can find what somebody was thinking, what somebody was saying. Supporting censorship contradicts the historian's role as a steward of diverse and inclusive narratives. And I'm afraid some historians do support this, but I think it's a really sad and unfortunate thing to do. And it's much more important for us to contextualise this information. Yes, it might be sexist. Yes, it might be racist. It might even be, it may be entirely political. But if we don't contextualise it, we lose the information. History is not a safe space. It shouldn't be a safe space. It's uncomfortable. It's a place of reckoning, a place of discovery and challenge. As a professional historian, I oppose the censorship of books in any of its forms. And I'm not just talking about people not being able to read or buy or look at. I'm just talking about more things being redacted when they don't need to be. I oppose this because I believe all books are equally good or worthy. I don't oppose this because I think all books are equally good or worthy, but because we must have the right to review them, to critique them and to learn from them. To censor them is to forget. To preserve, to question and to teach, well, that's the work of history. And believe me, as historians, we rely on your catalogues. We need to know what's in those details. We need that context. And whether it's a book buyer's catalogue, a library catalogue, a museum catalogue, the more information the better. And it can be layers of information. It doesn't all have to be accessible to everybody at the same time. We're pretty clever people now. We've got algorithms that can do all sorts of things. I can get my emails organised into less than 20 in my inbox. That's an algorithm. What we need now is to think about how we can use that technology to make sure that as much information as we can possibly get on each and every one of the items in your catalogues is available, and that we can add to it. Because what this is doing is not detracting from the material at all, it's value adding. And that's the part that I really want to emphasise, it's value adding. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. I like that, contextualising as value adding. Yes, I look forward to talking more about that. I would now like to introduce Nina Whittaker, who is Senior Librarian at Museums Victoria in Naarm. With over a decade of experience in museum libraries and rare collections, they research and teach reparative and anti-racist methods for cataloguing and rare documentary heritage. Nina will give practical examples from the library's perspective now and share their experience on this topic. So please welcome Nina Whittaker.
Kia ora koutou, hello, and welcome to the ILAB Symposium. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's great to be here. I'd like to start by just emphasising the acknowledgement of country. We're meeting here today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. The image that you see on the screen is a beautiful image of the Forest Gallery that's at the museum that I work at. And in that they've tried to replicate some of the nature and the environment of the Eastern Kulin Nations. It also has an interactive exhibition called Bikmilbu Dumba, or Country Always Speaks. And this shows the voices and the stories of people of the Eastern Kulin Nations from across the Kulin Nations as they talk about the nature that's on display. And so I think it's kind of comforting when you get to something like this where there's so much history and so much book history in particular. I think it can be comforting to think that we're just a small drop in the ocean compared to the history of this land and its people. So if you are visiting, I would really encourage you to take some time to explore that relationship because it truly is special. Dawn did a great job of introducing me, so I'm not going to reintroduce myself. Usually when I teach reparative cataloguing, it takes 1 to 2 hours minimum. I would ideally like a week. So we're going to try and do this in 20 minutes. It's going to be a little bit tight. And I'm going to start with the thing that I think librarians and trade cataloguers have in common. Then we're going to look at some key differences and then go into some practical examples. But I wanted to start with what we have in common because I think rare books cataloguers, people who work with rare books, but in particular the cataloguers, have a very interesting role that they can play in the unearthing of historical voices, hidden histories, and fragments of people's experiences. So the 3 points that I have up on the screen right now, the first one is that the books that we're working on might not be looked at again for a long time, and any cataloguers in the audience will know that feeling of dread when you've got that pile of books on your desk that looks so boring, and they, are about an uncompelling subject, like wooden propellers for, this certain type of plane. But you have to go through every single one of those books. You have to create a catalogue record for them. You are the only chance that this book has of connecting with a community that it might be relevant to, because literally no one else is going to pick it up. It's too boring. No offense to the book, but it's true. And so we are in a unique position where we're actually going through every single book. We can't judge a book by its cover because that's not how we operate. We have to go through every single item. And as we do so, we're specifically looking for bibliographic details. We're looking for interesting things. So in the way that a curator, for example, might look at a book and be looking for patterns or themes, we have to look at each individual book and say, what is interesting about you? What are your redeeming qualities? And how can we make sure that those can connect with relevant communities? And so I think because of these two things, Every record that we make is a potential for intervention, and it's a potential to add something to the historical record. So if you're cataloguing 10 books a day, that's 10 potential points of intervention. We are the best chance that a lot of these books are going to have of connecting with a person before they're put down again for another 10, 20 years. So I think in that regard, because we're dealing with the boring and the mundane, because we have to go through things where we're not judging a book by its cover or assuming anything about it, we can unearth these details that are incredibly important. So we've coordinated in advance so that we could all shout out Douglas Stewart once in our presentations. But I wanted to look at the potential differences that exist between a trade catalogue record and a library catalogue record. So this is the trade catalogue record, the beautiful trade catalogue record for the Hyakumanto Darani, which is the earliest dated printed text known. It's on display at the State Library if you'd like to go and have a look. So this is Doug Stewart's record. You can see it's absolutely beautiful. There's paragraphs, it's written in natural language, there's some images, and it's something that anyone without training could interact with and find meaning from. In contrast, this is the library catalogue record that I made for the book. You can see there's a few differences. There's no natural language here. I think even from the perspective of someone who works full-time in this area, it's immediately alienating. You don't know how to interact with it. It's gone from the 2,400 words that it was in the original trade record to just 500 here. It's severely circumscribed, it's very abstract, and it uses a lot of rules and dollar signs and codes that you might not be familiar with. So I like to think of the difference between trade cataloguing and librarian cataloguing as the difference between watercolor and Lego. So we're both describing an object. That's the goal. We want to describe an object so that it can connect with a community. But whereas a trade catalogue can deal in detail, it can deal in individual items, it can bring out these certain points of notice, the shadows of a work, the depths of a work. A library catalogue record is much more utilitarian. What we're doing is we're building a Lego representation of the same image. And so it's very clunky. We're working with fixed vocabularies, we're working with linked data, we're working with metadata standards that tell us exactly how to transcribe a field, exactly what needs to go where, what $2 indicates what controlled vocabulary. It's clunky. And it's made to be that way so that these records can be broken apart and then reconstituted in a different library, reused in another library. So they're made for distribution, large wholesale distribution and then reconstruction, especially through digital systems. So I wanted to sort of emphasize this difference because I want you as people who work in the book trade to feel comfortable knowing whether something is relevant for your cataloguing or not, because there's a lot going on in reparative cataloguing in the library space, and I have a feeling that if that's not your area of expertise, it would be overwhelming and you would come across a lot of things that just aren't relevant because they're focused on the way that the Lego is made or the way that the Lego is being distributed. And that's just not something that you need to worry about from the trade perspective. You have other concerns as well that I don't know about as I've never worked in the trade. And so I thought we could practice this immediately. So this is the standard slide that I use when I am teaching reparative cataloguing to librarians. You'll see it's got 4 key areas of reparative cataloguing. When I was thinking about what would be most relevant for this talk today, I cut out the bottom 2 because they are not relevant to the trades. And I hope that this shows that, with some confidence, you can interact with library reparative cataloguing material and exercise your own judgment, use your own expertise to say this part of it is relevant to my practice, this part I don't need to worry about, and be quite fearless and quite ruthless in cutting out things that you don't think that are part of the Lego process rather than the description process. So we're going to look at the top 2 and go into some concrete examples now. So reparative cataloguing is one of the 2 key areas that we're going to be looking at today. It's the subject of this presentation or this panel. And I think, Lynette's done a really fantastic job of introducing some of the key concepts in this area. It's about reducing harm. It's about making sure that people can interact with records safely. It's about looking at the systems that create those records and how those systems might be improved or made more accessible to people. And that's harmful language both contained within the book. So you might have a historical book that has slurs in it, but it's also the harm that is caused by the way that we've catalogued things historically and continue to catalogue things today. They were created in the context of oppression, often by large institutions that were part of the oppression. And so a lot of marginalised histories just don't appear in the way that we currently catalogue. I think the biggest harm at the moment is the silences that come from the way that we catalogue, the things that we deem as unimportant. People often think that reparative cataloguing is a form of censorship. They think, all right, let's get rid of all of the N-words that we see in any library record. And I think that might have been the case around 5 years ago, but things at the moment are evolving. There's a lot more nuance. In the conversations I've had recently, there have been things, for example, where a slur is used in a historical book in a derogatory way, but it's reclaimed by the community in another group. And they are reclaiming the term and using it on their own terms in publishing. And so you can't institute a blanket ban across these kind of harmful terms without losing that sense of nuance. And so rather than going into that territory or deciding what is offensive and what's not offensive, I think Lynette touched on books that reflect the historical attitudes of their time, but which might not actually be about a certain type of racism or sexism or whatever. It is about providing as much context as possible, and I think that's pretty amazing that we came to the same conclusion on that one. But it's about making sure that library users have as much context as possible so that when they see a word or they see an idea in a catalogue record, they know how to interpret it. And I think the easiest question to ask yourself when it comes to this is if a high school student was to look at this record, how would they repeat the words or the ideas that they see? Is there a clear framework that they can use to say, all right, so this is a historical term, this is, we don't know if it's appropriate or not, it might not be appropriate, this is why we're including it, because it is so important to know the context of a book, to know these sort of key things about it and not redact them. So you'll see on the slide, there's a list of statements of bias. So this is a long and evolving list. It's from the Cataloguing lab. But I would encourage you to look at it because the current approach to reparative cataloguing is to include as much context as possible, not to remove things, and then to contextualize it by including something like a statement of bias to say, hey, we know that what we have in our catalogue is not great in some areas. This is how you need to interpret these records. So yeah, that's an overview of that area. But then I also wanted to mention some work that's happening beyond reparative cataloguing in the more imaginative space. So kind of beyond systems. This is where I work a lot. It's in equity-based or anti-racist cataloguing. If it is driven and owned by Indigenous people, it can be an indigenizing force. But it's really about looking beyond the systems and saying, well, what actually can we do to dramatically increase the amount of information that is currently marginalized and hidden away in books? What are some positive actions that we can take, some proactive measures that we can take? And so on the left, you'll see that the historical cataloguing standards we have are very selective about what they think is important. So the author of a monograph will have much more importance than the 25 authors of a community publication, for example. And a book designer or an illustrator won't have the same status as a book author. Especially if you look at historical cataloguing, I think more and more these days we're seeing a full range of people from the book production world being acknowledged in a record, but even that is still sketchy. So the things that we choose as important and unimportant often reflect the predominant power structures because publishing is about being able to access certain types of materials and certain processes, and historically marginalized communities have had difficulty accessing those. So instead of asking, how can we change the system? How can we modify things so that we can describe this better? We say, how much space does this item need to tell its story? Systems be damned. And this is where I've developed a reputation as a maximalist because I make these awful, big records that are just full of text. But the idea is to maximize the amount of information we're getting out of the text, putting it out there, throwing it out into the ocean and seeing what people can do with it. So what space does this item need to tell its story? Not how much space do we have in the catalogue or how much space do we have on the website, or is it going to put people off? And although I talk about marginalised communities and marginalised information in books, it's not actually in the margins that you need to look for this information. The most common places that you'll find this information are CSN, which is not Crosby, Stills and Nash, but is content summary notes. And so I find that if you're going through a book and have a brief look through the contents, the summary, and any publication notes, you will usually find a marginalised voice. It's quite reliable. And so in this record, we're seeing the names of 56 women from the Country Women's Association of Echuca, which is a small town in Victoria. And this is a cookbook. And so just by adding in the contents, I've got the names of 56 women living in rural areas. And yes, I don't have their full names, but this exposes a network of, people who are working together, women who knew each other through a specific organisation. And there is value in having those names out there and findable. So it looks monstrous as a record, and that isn't even all of the contents, but this is the kind of thing that we're exploring when we're talking about making history more accessible. It's not that we don't have histories of rural women, it's that they're in places like this and we don't catalogue this material. However, names are meaningless without attention to detail. And this is an area where I think anyone who's multilingual, anyone who's got different language skills or is interested in linguistics should really be coming forward. I think this is an area that's going to grow rapidly in the next few years. I hope it does. Because marginalised communities often mean marginalised languages. And those marginalised languages were usually transcribed by a dominant language. And as dominant languages changed over time, they recorded things in different ways. So you can get an Indigenous person who's got 15 different spellings of the name, depending on whether they met a Danish person, or a German person, or a French person, and depending on what decade they met them in. And it's a huge, I think, source of fragmentation of different identities because you can't follow something from start to finish. There are all of these records around. You think you've done the right job by putting the name in, but that romanization isn't known to anyone, so they can't connect it to that specific house. So on the left, you'll see Travels Through Arabia. This was a book exploring southern Yemen, and it was originally recorded by a Danish person who was traveling through the area. The book was published in German, and this is the English translation. So you'll see I managed to find the modern Arabic names for the places. There's very little relation between the two. I actually had to go through the map in the book from 1792 and find the specific areas and try and compare them to come up with these. And so all of those names that you see that are written in unfamiliar romanization are names that would be lost if you just transcribe them. So these are the areas where I think linguists need to come forward, anyone who's working with multiple languages, and we need to come up with a way to record them and connect them so that people can have a more full idea of what is being said about their ancestors. Final couple of examples. I know I'm doing okay for time. The wildcards, and this I'm sure you've all come across in your cataloguing. They're things that don't belong anywhere in a record, but are still a very interesting example of an interaction between book publication or production and a community of interest. So you'll see on the top there, it's a book of poems. It looks like a very standard book of poems, but on the verso of the title page, it had this note that the typesetting had been done as part of a university's paying the rent, which is a way of sort of giving back as an acknowledgement that you are on unceded lands. And I think that's a really interesting example because it shows a historical collaboration that's based around a reparative design that just would not have a place anywhere in a record, but is of great interest to researchers. So that's wildcard 1. The second one below it is it was a book of biographies of Black women. And the publication was funded by a historically Black sorority that was founded at Howard University, which is a historically Black university. It's hugely significant. And that detail that the sorority had funded the publication of this book was something that was missing from the record, but absolutely crucial to the context of where it was created and why it was created. So these kind of wildcards are the things that no one is looking for, but rare books cataloguers having to plod through our piles of books, we can find them, and that's a hugely important point of intervention. And finally, yes, this is a bog standard work of Voltaire, or so I thought. So I was going through this book, 1754, is a selection of works by Voltaire, and in doing the usual checklist, contents, summary, notes, looking through the contents, I came across this section that was it was an account of a white Moor. And I thought, well, that's an unusual way of saying anything. When I looked on the internet, it seemed to be a reference to Northern African people. But I thought I would double check in the text itself. And then looking in the text itself, it was the history of a person with albinism who was born in Africa and then moved to Paris. And the history of albinism is, I have a colleague who has a daughter who's got albinism, and they call it the unicorn, it's everywhere. But people don't know what to look for, and so it's often this thing of trying to grasp at straws. But in this case, here we have something that's hidden right in the middle of a work by Voltaire that you wouldn't expect to find in a place like that. And what I've done is I've put person with albinism in square brackets so that people who are using modern terminology can see the old term. But in the way that Lynette was touching on about not censoring things and really making sure that the original context and the original wording is used, I've also left white Moor in. And what that does is if a researcher comes across this book, they will know that there was an alternative term that was being used at the time, something that they can launch off and then use to potentially find more resources. So while the square brackets are important and the modern terminology is important, it's just as important to keep these historical terms in the record as well. So I'm running out of time probably, but I wanted to quickly mention that all of the interventions that I've looked at so far have been based around the work, which is to say the content of the book rather than the physical properties of the book, the item level. And that's because I think there is a bit of discomfort and a little bit of, I feel like it's been added in at the last minute when it comes to library cataloging. Holdings and items are treated differently at every institution. I've worked with 5 different library systems, and it's always the troublesome extra thing that you have to think about at the end. So whilst individual institutions might do an excellent job of having bindings or describing provenance, when it comes together in a union catalogue, when it's moving through the system, it's often the piece that falls off. And I think the flexible, detail-oriented nature of trade cataloging makes you uniquely placed to deal with this. And I know that when I was doing rare books cataloging full-time, I would say at least 3 times a week, I would be looking at trade records for information on a book plate or on some inscription of some kind. So I think in terms of areas that need work and areas where you can make a huge contribution, this item level information is an area where you are excelling and where people are using your records. So I just wanted to draw that to your attention as well. And just to close off, I wanted to end with a plea. So it's all well and good to have an excellently described record, but one of the most common things that I've come across is right when you think you've got the hidden link to a woman collector's name or this book plate belongs to this person, you click on a link that's been indexed in Google and it shows up with this. And that happens so frequently. It doesn't matter what you do if no one can access it. And this particularly, I think it's after the point of sale. I think some websites have something where the listing automatically goes down and the description also goes away. And I've noticed alternatives where it says sold, but the description is still present. So if you could do anything to start with that will help to ensure that your work is more accessible and that your recording of history makes an impact, it would be to make sure that your website continues to list things after they are sold, because you don't know how many people are trying to get into those websites, and how many crucial things are in your records that people are using. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nina. A lot to think about there, a lot of richness, and thank you for acknowledging what the booksellers do in this space. That I really appreciate learning that we can work together in this. This brings me to our third panellist today. Alexander Aiken is the son of a steelworker union organiser and an anthropologist. He received a PhD in Chinese history from Harvard University and became co-owner of Booksellers Books in 2013. Melding his academic interests with his family's multi-generational activist tradition, he has expanded the bookstore's purview to include Asian language materials, while also cataloguing materials related to labour and radical history. As president of the ABAA, we've asked him to round out this session by making a presentation about the description and display guidelines the American Association has put into place for its members. So please welcome Alexander Aiken.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, I want to echo and endorse the acknowledgements of country that were given by the speakers ahead of me. I'm lucky enough to be a guest here in more ways than one. So I'll be discussing the description and display recommendations that the ABAA's diversity initiative created for the reference of our members and for anyone else who might find them useful. Let me get to my slides. Yeah, here we go. So the genesis of these recommendations was a panel hosted by our diversity initiative about inclusive cataloging. It was a discussion that included both librarians and booksellers. As members of the diversity initiative began to draft a document, it was shared at different stages with a number of figures who were very generous with their feedback. And the Archive for Black Lives had some model guidelines that were consulted as well. I want to say the point of our recommendations is not at all to prevent the sale of uncomfortable material from the past. I personally believe there are many good reasons to collect racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic, and otherwise offensive historical items. Frank Wu, the president of Queens College in New York, is a Chinese-American collector of anti-Asian propaganda from the past. In an essay he wrote titled "Why I Collect Racism," he noted that, quote, "I would like to disrupt our shared comfort." He argues that the greater the upset caused by references to the past, the more intense the urge toward action for the future. The Jim Crow Museum has as its motto, "Teaching tolerance with objects of intolerance." It began as the personal collection of David Pilgrim, a sociology professor at Ferris State University in Michigan, and it's now situated in a building on that campus. You can even, from Australia, take a virtual tour online of its collections. So the point here is not to remove this material from the trade or in any way to censor it. Each of us can choose what we personally want to have in our stock, and some of us do walk a fine line, because there will always be some who feel that certain items should not be sold or exhibited or even preserved, and who won't be placated by any form of contextualization or any method of cataloging or display. Now, every country has its own situation. In the United States, we have a history in which the native population was largely wiped out, the survivors generally dispossessed and often forced into reservations. The once very popular genre of Western Americana includes many books that celebrate the Indian Wars, which have largely come to be seen through a very different lens. Even works lamenting the demise of Native cultures, which go back almost as far as those celebrating it, or critiques of government policy towards Native people have often been seen as patronizing from the perspective of Native Americans themselves. Obviously, we also have a legacy of slavery, which generated enormous amounts of records, such as this manuscript receipt for the sale of a little girl in North Carolina in 1817, which I recently purchased from a colleague, as well as countless publications documenting, defending, or criticizing the practice. After a civil war that forced an end to slavery, Southern states still fostered a strong nostalgic movement for bygone days, manifested in popular culture, for example, in sheet music, depicting peaceful plantation scenes where Black people happily picked cotton. This example was actually an Australian reprint, so this nostalgia had a global circulation. In the mid-20th century, as the federal government and the US Supreme Court grew more active in pressing for equality, banning racial segregation, Regional defiance was reflected in overtly racist propaganda. As a bookseller, one of my specialties is the sort of leaflets that people like this were handing out. There are relentless efforts to whitewash this history, to pretend it wasn't really that bad. And my position is that I refuse to let the ugly truth be hidden. After the War of 1848 led to the United States absorption of a huge swath of Mexican territory, the longtime land rights and contracts with local residents that were supposed to be preserved were often ignored or discarded. Descendants of the original Mexican inhabitants treated as second-class citizens. In the 1880s, the US government explicitly banned the immigration of most Asians, with those who were still able to come facing all sorts of discrimination, and in the case of Japanese Americans, internment during World War II. A fair number of Chinese residents who were able to remain in the United States during this period went into the laundry business, and there were often racist calls to boycott their establishments. This is the sort of thing that Frank Wu was talking about collecting. This is a trade card advertising laundry soap, suggesting that any homemaker could wash clothes just as clean without employing a Chinese laundryman, because after all, the laundryman was using soapine anyway. So there are many people in the United States who are very sensitive about the way the items I've illustrated here are described. Within the American political and cultural context, the way we describe them is, on a small scale, not only a reflection of the way we perceive history, but the way we perceive and interact with the people around us who are descendants of the Native Americans who were displaced and warred against, the African people who were enslaved, other minorities that were mocked and belittled, not only in popular culture, but by the laws of the land. Different countries have their own equivalents, obviously. Here in Australia, the treatment of Indigenous people has echoes of the legacy of Native Americans. And there are other areas of deeply tragic similarity. There's been quite a lot of discussion about how institutions like museums can address these histories. I was very moved by a subtle yet impactful exhibit at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam last year. In 1795, upon the establishment of the Batavian Republic in the Netherlands, liberty trees were planted to celebrate the new government. At left in this case is a twig that was clipped from an original liberty tree. In the past, this might have stood alone in the museum with a caption discussing the Republic's tenets of equality, liberty, and fraternity. But if you look to the right in the same case, though, you'll see wooden leg cuffs from the Dutch colony of Curaçao, which were used on an enslaved person to restrict his movement. This pairing in a single case makes a powerful statement about the limits of liberty under the Republic and the kinds of unfortunate details that might be ignored in patriotic narratives. I point this out to show that every place has some complicated stories to tell. Booksellers, as merchants of historical material, have a role to play in how these narratives are presented. Several years ago, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America issued its recommendations and best practices for cataloging sensitive material. As I've mentioned, these recommendations drew together input from fellow members, scholars, and librarians. They're meant to be an evolving resource. They make no pretense of being a final authority on these issues, nor are they comprehensive in their scope. To quote the introduction, engaging with culturally sensitive material in such a way that ensures the dignity of the community or communities involved is necessary, important work, and we will all be better catalogers for doing it. The introduction goes on to say that as purveyors of such material, booksellers play a unique and sometimes fraught role. We're both purchasers and sellers, tasked at both ends of the transaction with being the public face of the market for this material, and therefore responsible for handling it in a way that's respectful to our customers and to the material itself. Everyone here is free to look up our recommendations. The URL is at the bottom here. I'm sorry that's a little small. It'll be repeated in some later slides. So in any case, I won't delve into them in exhaustive detail here, but the central essence boils down to three words: by, for, and about. In other words, who was the author or creator of the material, who was the intended audience, and what community is the material about. Let's take a look at Helen Bannerman's Little Black Sambo, a children's book which was highly influential, translated into many languages, and with many imitations over the years. These have often been described as Black Americana or African Americana by many people in the book trade. But who are these books by, for, and about? Well, the books are by Helen Bannerman, a Scottish woman, and although they're ostensibly about Black characters, the illustrations in most editions rely on tropes and caricatures that everyone will recognize as racist. They were meant for a white audience, not a Black one. This is not Black Americana, even though some imitations draw on similar sources as those used in some African American folktales. All of Bannerman's original stories are actually set in India. So clearly, booksellers need to find a more accurate way to describe these books than Black Americana. By the same token, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion should never be cataloged as Judaica, even though this fraudulent work claims to consist of secret Jewish directions for conquering the world. The recommendations discuss how one might use bracketing and descriptive terms in cataloging such materials. One way to handle Little Black Sambo, for example, might be to use children's literature and racist caricature together, thereby allowing us to acknowledge both the book's historical designation as being a classic of children's literature and at the same time the demeaning portrayal of its protagonist, which occurs in so many illustrated editions. The ABA's recommendations also discuss the display of such material in contexts such as book fairs. They say, quote, "We recommend that members be mindful of customers' possible reactions to the central or prominent placement of images that are dehumanizing, racist, sexist, homophobic, or violent, whether in catalogs, on our websites, or displayed in our booths at book fairs. This is not to say that such items shouldn't be displayed. Rather, one should be conscious of the possible signals you're sending and mindful of possible reactions." This is a leaflet with a rather stark graphic, which I personally chose to exhibit front and center in my case at a book fair. It was a considered decision. The original goal of the issuer, the National Negro Congress, was to shock the reader out of complacency. The Senate of the United States, in the year this was issued, 1938, was considering legislation to ban lynching, and Southern senators were filibustering to prevent its passage. This leaflet called it the shame of America. I was ready to speak with anyone who was upset about the graphic image, to ask them, what's more repulsive, the depiction on this flyer or the fact that as of that year when I was selling it, the Senate had still not banned lynching, something it finally did in 2022, after more than 100 years and 200 failed attempts by legislators to pass anti-lynching legislation. To display this prominently was a choice that I made. I prepared for it rather than potentially stumbling by accident into a very uncomfortable situation. Someone who felt the same way that I did purchased it and is now at an institution where it helps to document the strategies of early civil rights organizers in the 1930s. Another important issue that the recommendations touch upon is communicating with customers. Tamar Evangelista Doherty wrote on Twitter about her experience walking around the New York Book Fair. That's one of the fairs that my organization, the ABA, puts on. She was director of the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. In other words, one of the most powerful buyers in the room. But she was ignored or dismissed by many dealers because they took one look at her and jumped to conclusions. Her post stirred a lot of discussion within the ABA. Often these kinds of experiences or these stories are only shared with trusted friends. So I'm really grateful to Tamar for going public with her experience and forcing some in our trade who were in denial to see that this issue really does exist. A close friend of mine who used to work as a librarian at Harvard had a similar story. As a Black woman, she had the experience of walking into booths at the Boston Book Fair and having booksellers immediately jump to conclusions about what she was looking for. In one case, an exhibitor didn't say a single word before whipping out a copy of, does anyone want to guess what book? Little Black Sambo, to show her. If anyone had bothered to ask about her interests first, they would have known that she reads Japanese and personally collects Japanese children's books. But no one asked. Now, if someone does mention interest in a field such as African Americana, for example, we can follow up with questions to better understand. The ABA's recommendations provide some examples of follow-up questions. For example, are they collecting materials that are broadly by, for, or about African American individuals or communities? Are they specifically focused on Black authors or activists? Are they interested more broadly in empowering as well as oppressive parts of Black history? Are they also collecting images of Black Americans produced for white audiences? Most importantly for us as booksellers, how can we offer material that fits within and respects their collection's parameters? At the end of the ABA's recommendations, there's a list of additional resources, including style guides issued by various advocacy organizations and links to readings and recordings of relevant talks. I might say something very quickly about the reaction to these recommendations within the ABA. There was some internal dissent from a vocal minority who saw them as some sort of Orwellian thought control. But these are meant to assist our members, not to constrain or limit them. One has the right to ignore them, but I think it's better for one's business to take them under consideration. I've heard many dealers express trepidation about listing particular items because they say they don't know where the current cultural tripwires lie. These recommendations are there to help people in these kinds of situations. To give one quick example, one of our members had an original photo postcard depicting the aftermath of a lynching. The image is less graphic than many such images because it was taken from a faraway vantage point, so I'm going to go ahead and show it here. It shows a structure in Springfield, Missouri, from which hung the burned remains of two Black men, identified as Horace Duncan and Fred Coker, as a large crowd stood around looking. My colleague was understandably worried about reactions that it might generate if he included this item in a virtual book fair. So he sent me his draft description. And the first key word he used in his draft description was African Americana. I showed him the ABA recommendations and how they urge the cataloger to think in terms of by, for, and about. African Americana isn't a fitting top category for this item. Material like this could use perhaps something like lynching as the top category, which immediately lets the potential customer know what to expect. There are collectors of African American historical material who want nothing to do with such items, but there are also others who do want to preserve this type of evidence in all of its brutality. I believe that we can be better catalogers and better business people by devoting some attention to these issues. Becoming more attuned to the diversity that exists within the large community of collectors is indispensable if we want to appeal to new audiences and new generations of book lovers. I look forward to hearing thoughts of colleagues from around the world about the situation in their own countries. And I want to emphasize that in a spirit of humility, we at the ABA are always open to suggestions for how we can improve our own recommendations. Thank you.